Good evening. Thank you for logging on to the Lessons of Vietnam show, where we attempt to tell the real story of the Vietnam War and those involved. We are privileged to broadcast from the studios of Nissan Communications. I am Bill Dixon, your host, veteran 6768 of Vietnam. I serve with the headquarters company, 15 Engineer Group at Long Binh near Bien Hoa Air Base, 20 miles north of Saigon. Tonight, we have a very special guest, Howard Patrick, Vietnam veteran and author of A Never-Ending Battle, A Soldier's Ongoing Struggle with Combat Post-Traumatic Stress. I highly recommend, if you know a veteran who is also struggling with post-traumatic stress, that you contact them and encourage them to watch the show on demand, or if they can, tonight while we're on a live show. Everyone is invited to take part with questions or comments. Just call or Skype the show numbers. First slide. There's your numbers for Skype. And there's your numbers for the to call in on, 919-518-9773. If you have a question, a comment, or whatever for Howard, just call in and we'll let him know what you said and so forth. And if you're out there and you do have a need to talk to someone, this is the numbers to talk to. You got some good people there waiting to talk to you. This Christmas time of the year and the first of the year can put a lot of stress on veterans out there and so forth. So if you listen to the show and have need to talk to someone, call these numbers and so forth. Now let's talk about Howard here. Howard is broadcasting tonight with us from Philadelphia, and they didn't get any snow. I'm here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we got 7 inches in a day. That's 7 inches more than we normally get for a year. The book is A Never-Ending Battle, How Vietnam Changed Me Forever. Howard Patrick is a combat veteran of the Vietnam War who suffered from acute post-traumatic stress disorder for over 40 years. Wrote his autobiography in the hopes it would provide his family with an understanding of how his wartime experiences and PTSD changed him, thereby affecting their lives as well. And it does affect the families a great deal because they just don't understand the situation. Not only did his family benefit from reading it, the book had a very positive impact on others beyond his family circle, including veterans and medical professionals. The feedback he received was so overwhelmingly positive, he published his book to help other combat veterans who may also be suffering from grips of post-traumatic stress, as well as provide valuable advice and support for their families. Howard, I'm going to turn it over to you, and it's your show, and tell us about you and your book or whatever you'd like to talk to us about.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure being on the show. My story, I guess, starts when I graduated high school. That was in June of 1961. And a few months later, I turned 18. Did pretty much what we all did back then at 18 years old. We signed up for the draft, never thinking in my mind that I would ever be in the military. My plans were to go to college. I had no plans after that, but there was nothing going on from a conflict standpoint that our country was involved in. So I didn't give the military any thoughts whatsoever. After 1 year of college, I realized that liberal arts wasn't doing anything for me, so I switched off to nights, spent 2 years at night school, and all through this time I had a 2S deferment, which was a school deferment that kept me from being drafted. After those 3 years, I spent 2 years in an electronic engineering technology program in Philadelphia, which enabled me to take a job at the conclusion of that course with IBM as a computer technician. But 6 months before that, I found my wife, Judy. We got married in June of 1966, and then in October of 66 is when I graduated from the school. IBM put me to work right away, and still there was no thoughts in my mind whatsoever about the military. But 5 months later, that changed pretty drastically when I came home from work one day, and Judy was sitting there in a chair with a letter in her hand, which turned out to be my draft notice. Uh, I went the next day to IBM, told them what I received. They got me a 1 month deferment, and that was the best they could do for me. In May of I'm sorry, in May of 1967, I reported into the processing center in Philadelphia. Didn't want to be there, but didn't have much choice. And during that processing, we got uniforms, we got shots, we got checked out medically, put on a train, and wound up at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, about 4 or 5 hours later. And that's where I did basic training. During all that time, which was about 4 or 5 months, the only thing that people talked about was Vietnam. You know, it was 1967. Vietnam was really exploding, so to speak, and everybody felt that that's where we were all going to wind up. At the end of basic training is a program called AIT, Advanced Individual Training. And for me and most of my comrades from basic, we wound up in advanced infantry training, expecting to get shipped out to Vietnam immediately after that happened. When I first got into basic training, they give you a bunch of tests to figure out what you're best suited for. And I was offered OCS, Officer Candidate School. I could have come out a second lieutenant, and it seemed enticing. But when I was told that it took 10 months to get the lieutenant bar, and then you had to give the Army 2 years after that, it was too much for me to handle to spend 10 extra months in the service. If I wasn't married, it might have been a different thing. But at that time, I didn't want to give the Army 10 extra days, let alone 10 months. So I turned it down. But after AIT, expecting to get sent to Vietnam, instead they sent me to NCO school. The Army was experiencing a lot of loss of non-commissioned officers. Those are the sergeants. And as a result, they started NCO school specifically to train people to be squad leaders and fire team leaders in Vietnam. So they sent me off to South Carolina, to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. One of the nice things about that time, though, was I was able to bring Judy down there with me and actually live off base. So that helped quite a bit. From Fort Jackson, I went off to Georgia and had some training there as well. The total was, I believe it was 22 weeks for the NCO school. And then I had a 30-day leave before I was scheduled to ship out to Vietnam. During this time, however, in NCO school, we found out that Judy was pregnant, and she actually gave birth 10 days before I left for Vietnam. So off I went in June of 1968. Wound up at Benoit Airfield, which was a center set up to handle the influx of the new replacement recruits. In fact, there's a picture of it right there. Doesn't look too bad there, but they probably dummied up the picture in some way. At any rate, we were separated by unit. They started calling out all of us that got into the processing center from the plane and putting us in groups. And when there were only two of us left, we found out that we were scheduled to go to the 1st Cavalry Division, which we had heard about. We were told, if you're, there's the insignia. If you're going to be in Vietnam and you're in the Army, you don't want to be in the 1st Cav. To some people, that they felt it was worse than being in the Marines. At any rate, they shipped the two of us up to Quang Tri, which was right up near the demilitarized zone, which was the dividing line between North and South Vietnam. I reported in and was told I was being assigned to E Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment of the 1st Cav, which was a newly formed unit specifically put together for reconnaissance work. Echo Company was primarily a recon unit and was based out of An Khe, which was in the Central Highlands, but our unit worked out of Quang Tri, like I said, which was right below the DMZ. The mission of Echo Recon was to gather information, to go out. Don't have contact with the enemy if you can help it. Just gather whatever kind of information can be determined and turn that back in to the command center back at the base. When I got there, as a result of being in the NCO school, I was a sergeant, and I was assigned as a squad leader, the 2nd Squad of Echo Recon. As it turned out, in spite of the orders not to have contact as much as possible, our little unit, and it was a very small unit, for the first year of its operation, had the highest kill ratio of any unit in the 1st Cavalry Division during that same period of time. So we were involved in much more than we were told we should expect.
Howard, let me ask you for our audience out here, how many men are usually in a recon unit? Very small unit.
Very small units. When I got there, Echo Company had about 15 guys in it, and it was all one squad because it was only a month old. I became the 2nd Squad leader, and they took the 15 men and basically just cut them in half and assigned half of them to me. On any given day, we may have had more than that 7 or 8, or we may have had less depending upon circumstances. But we never had more than about 8 or 10 people in a squad at any one time. And most of our reconnaissance work was squad size. We would often go out just a single squad on a mission. There were other times when it would be considered a company operation, and the company only consisted of 2 squads at that time. So we were under 20 people, and that was about the most we ever went out with at any one time. Excuse me. You looked like you were going to say something, Bill.
Nope, I was just waiting for you.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay. As I said, we were told not to have any enemy contact if we could avoid it. However, if we were going to be out for multiple days at a time, they often had us set up night ambushes where we would set up off the side of a trail and hope that a group of VC, Viet Cong, which were the local guerrillas, or the NVA, which is North Vietnam Army soldiers, would come by, and we would take them on.
Well, how did you,
We
out there at night, and there were not a lot of street lights, as you remember, in the jungles of Vietnam and so forth, but you got 7 or 8 guys, and these guys are coming by. There may be 100 of them. Even if you ambush them, you're kind of outnumbered, which would be a good reason not to get involved.
Well, we were selective. If we saw a very large group coming by, we would just let them walk by. But we did have trip flares that if anybody hit the wire that set off the trip flare, that would light up the area. We also had um, I just had a loss of the mines,
The
the
Claymores?
Claymore. Thank you, Bill. Claymore mines, which were designed specifically to um, when it exploded, which was done by one of the men pushing a plunger. That would cause it to explode and shoot out what looked like tiny little marbles or ball bearings. Uh, a couple of thousand of them in a pretty wide angle. So that would usually do the job that needed to be done. On one occasion, however, uh, there were times when we really ran into issues that should have been very detrimental to us and didn't turn out that way. On this one one night, there's the picture of the Claymore mine. Uh, one night when we set up for an ambush, we set the claymores out. And if Bill can flash that picture up again one more time of the claymore, you can see it's curved and it says front towards enemy, and that's the direction that the ball bearings would shoot out. Uh, During the night, we heard a lot of noises. We weren't sure if they were animals. We weren't sure if they were enemy soldiers. We thought they were, but we weren't certain. And we held off blowing any of the mines or opening fire anywhere. And when we got our act together in the morning after daylight, we found that every one of the Claymore mines that we had set up had been turned around. So the area that explodes out was now facing in towards us instead of out towards them. That turned out to be a pretty scary situation, knowing what could have happened if we had opened fire. As a result, every time we set claymores out after that, we had pressure switches on them, so that if they were picked up, the pressure switch would cause the mine to explode. But there were times when we should have taken casualties, severe casualties, and for some reason we didn't. For example, we were on a 2-squad mission, and we were walking down a ridge of a mountainside, and all of a sudden one of our helicopters started flying overhead. Unbeknownst to us, on the other side of that ridge were NVA soldiers, and they fired at the helicopter. The helicopter, instead of returning fire, took off in a different direction and just left the area immediately. And what happened after that was two of our Cobra gunships, which were armed with rockets and grenade launchers. There's a picture of one of them, and you can see the rocket on the side of the little wing there in the center of the ship. Pardon me. The NVA that were shooting at the helicopters immediately got out of sight when they saw the gunships, and the only people that the gunship pilots saw was us walking down this ridge. And so who did they open up on? They opened up on us. And there were 2 of them, and they both got a chance to unload a series of rockets on the trail that we were on. As we saw them coming and as we saw the rockets coming, we got off the trail as best we could and as quickly as we could. And almost everybody on that mission got wounded, but fortunately nobody died and nobody's wounds were very serious. How we managed to escape such a situation is an unanswerable question.
Well, I don't know who come up with the word friendly fire, but it ain't nothing friendly about it.
There's nothing at all friendly about it. It's just the opposite. We had a couple of other instances where we also should have been hurt, should have been killed, possibly. Sometimes when we got into firefights with the enemies, we called in artillery support. And often we would call for one round of artillery. We'd give them the coordinates, and they do the firing from the base that they were on, many, many miles away. And we would ask for that one round to make sure that it was on target. And in this one instance, that one round landed right in the center of a group of us. If we squatted down, we could have touched it. It was just laying there. And for some reason, it turned out to be a dud. It never exploded. If it had, there would have been at least 6 of us that never would have made it home alive. In fact, there's a picture of an unexploded 105 millimeter artillery round. One other instance that I experienced that somebody was definitely watching me. As the squad leader, I would always pick somebody when we went out on a recon mission to be the point man. Point man is leading the rest of us and is looking for tripwires and booby traps and anything else that could be disastrous to us. And fortunately, we had 2 guys that didn't mind being on point. So they were usually, one or the other was usually the point man almost every time we went out. But one day I said to myself, I'm the squad leader. I shouldn't be telling my men to do anything that I wouldn't or haven't done myself. So that day I decided I was going to take point, which I did. And the second guy behind me was, there's a picture of what we might have looked like going down a trail. With the second guy behind me, maybe 10 or 15 yards behind me. And as we came to a right-hand curve in the trail, the guy behind me obviously lost sight of me. And as I made that turn, I came face to face with a VC soldier with an AK-47 in his hands, facing me about 10 feet away. My M16 rifle, was cradled across both hands, both arms, but it was facing a little bit down. And the VC point man, his AK-47 was pointed right at my chest. The couple of seconds, the next couple of seconds probably seemed like minutes or maybe even longer. I wasn't sure what to do. I knew if I fired my weapon, the best I could do is hit him in the leg the way it was pointed. If I raised it up, he'd probably fire immediately and I wouldn't even get a shot off. So I hesitated. I did nothing. And unbelievably, he pointed his rifle down to the ground, turned around and walked away. How in the world I was spared is a question that I ask myself to this day. And of course, there is no answer. There's a lot of guesswork, but I do believe that somebody was watching over me that day and other days where similar things happened.
I imagine you think about that often.
Too often, yes. There was a time when I thought about it almost every day, and over the years, I've had a lot of nightmares, a lot of flashbacks. Uh, but what can I say?
Yeah.
I was with Echo Recon for about 5 months until one day we were in a firefight, very extensive firefight. Actually, it wasn't one day; it was 3 days worth. And during that time, we expended most of our ammunition, ate what little food we had, and finally, when the firefight ended, and we were able to get our wounded and dead out of the area, we were able to get helicopters in, medevac helicopters, which we had not been able to do during the 3 days because of the heavy fire that we were experiencing from the enemy. But on that first helicopter that came in, our company commander came in with it and looked around, saw that the platoon leader was wounded, the platoon sergeant was wounded. He looked at me, he said, Sergeant Patrick, you're now the acting platoon sergeant. Get everybody together, and we're going to go out and get those guys that just did all this to my company. And I looked at him and said, sir, with all due respect, we don't have much ammunition. We don't have any food. We've been here 3 days. We're exhausted. We're wiped out. If we go after them, we're all going to die. And at that point, he said to me that he was giving me a direct order, and if I didn't follow his orders, he was going to have me court-martialed. So I got everybody together and took them back to the base camp, and never saw the captain again. Never heard from him. But 10 days later, I got orders that transferred me out of Echo Recon. So that was, I'm sure, a direct result of my disobeying his orders. So they sent me to headquarters company of the 2nd Brigade, and I was assigned as the NCO in charge of a civil affairs unit, which I knew nothing about. Civil affairs was designed, there I am, in front of one of the civil affairs vehicles, to win the hearts and minds of the local people and of the VC and have them surrender and change their affiliation back to the government rather than to the North Vietnamese communists.
The Chu Hoi program.
The Chu Hoi program, the surrender program.
Yeah.
And so we would go out to villages. We would do what they called med caps, where we would go out with a doctor, some nurses to a village and give them medical care and attention, things like that. We brought food out to villages. We brought movies, John Wayne movies. They love things like that to the various villages. And the second or third day that I was with Civil Affairs, my lieutenant called me in and said, by the way, you're also attached to the 6th PSYOPs Battalion. And my reaction was, what's a PSYOPs? And of course, it stands for Psychological Operations. And what we did back then was we would go up in helicopters with a 1,000-watt speaker system hanging out of one of the open doorways, and a Vietnamese interpreter who would broadcast in Vietnamese over the speaker system, telling the VC that they should surrender. And while he was doing that, I was standing or sitting, squatting next to the other side of the helicopter, the other open doors, dumping surrender leaflets out of the helicopter, Chu Hoi leaflets, we call them. And we would paper the area with a couple of thousand of those at a time. And every time we took off and flew one of those missions, we always took gunfire from the guys that we were trying to get to surrender. You know, they'd be on the ground, we'd be flying over, and we had to fly fairly low to get the leaflets to do what we expected them to do. So we were a slow-moving target, and on one occasion, instead of taking fire from just an AK-47 rifle, we started taking fire from a 51 caliber machine gun, which actually knocked out our engine, and we had gone up from one end of the airfield from the base that we were on, and we started circling around, and we were halfway towards the other end of where that runway would have been when this happened. And the pilot miraculously was able to auto rotate the rotors in some fashion and bring the helicopter back to the base. He actually swung it around, and we were coming down hard and fast. But when we first hit the ground, we were on the other end of the runway that we had taken off from. And we hit it so hard, we bounced up, and we actually bounced up and down about 10 or 12 times from the end of the runway that we first hit to almost the exact spot that we had taken off from. And of course, they had a crash crew out there. They had the firemen and the hoses and everything. And when we saw the helicopter and saw the holes in it, it was amazing what that pilot did. But we all walked away from it without any issues. Nobody got hurt, and that was my last helicopter ride in Vietnam. In fact, my last helicopter ride, period. Almost my last. My last was in one of these called a Loach, which was an acronym for LOCH, Light Observation Helicopter, something like that. And it was about a week and a half or 2 weeks when that happened before I was scheduled to leave Vietnam. So I respectfully told my lieutenant that I was not going out on another mission, certainly not in a helicopter. And I was just going to stay on the base until it was time for me to get out of that country. And that picture of the light observation helicopter, the day I was scheduled to go back to Ben Hoa Airfield, which is where I was departing from, the same helicopter pilot that brought the helicopter down that got shot down, got a hold of me and said, "Come on, I'll fly you over to Ben Hoa." And I said, "No, thanks. I'll wait and take a truck. I don't want to be in another helicopter." And he said, "Well, I have to get it out of here because if anybody sees it here, they'll arrest me for stealing it. So I may as well. You better get in, and I may as well take you over there." Which I did, and he did. And that was my last helicopter ride ever. So we went from Ben Hoa to Oakland, California, with a stopover for fuel in Hawaii. So a day later, I was out of Vietnam, back in the United States, and a day after that, I was processed out and on a plane back to Philadelphia. So, within 48 hours, I went from a combat zone back to the United States, and was expected to just go back to my normal life that I left 2 years before, which was almost impossible to do. When I did get to Philadelphia, Judy and my almost 1-year-old daughter, I think 2 weeks shy of 1 year old, And my parents and my sister were all there waiting for me. And Judy had gone back to live with her parents while I was gone, so that's where we went. And this was in May, and I took the summer off, did nothing, and then went back to IBM in September or October. I don't quite remember which.
Howard,
And
you said you took the summer off. You came, so when you left Vietnam, your service time was up.
My service time was up. Yes.
Okay. So you came back and did
I
nothing a little bit.
and I was discharged out of Oakland, California.
How did you relate back into civilian life? It was so different than what you were used to, and so forth. Were you having flashbacks and dreams then? Loud noises bothering you? What was the difference? Even though you were stateside, you still brought Vietnam back home with you.
I brought it home with me, and it's still with me. Not quite as badly as it was over the early years, but when I said I took the summer off, I did nothing. I didn't go back to work. Just hung around with Judy and with Ellen, our daughter, and knew I was different. Knew I had changed. Judy knew I had changed, but never said anything about it. And one part of me said, "Well, everything is normal. Everything's back to normal. I'm glad to be home, and I'm okay." But I really wasn't. When I went back to work for IBM, there were times when I saw people. This was in downtown Philadelphia. It was the office that I worked out of, and it was a pretty active office and a lot of people. And I started seeing some people that I hadn't seen, obviously, in 2 years. And I remember one instance where I was walking down the hall, and a fella, Jeff, was walking towards me, and he stopped and he looked at me. He said, "Howard, is that you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he was friendly. He shook my hand. "How you been? Where you been? What's going on?" And I said, "I just got back from Vietnam." And all of a sudden it was, "Oh, gee, I didn't know you were over there." And he started physically backing away from me. And next thing I knew, he said, "Listen, I got a meeting to go to. I got to run. I'll see you later." And it was like that with many, many people. Once they heard I was a Vietnam vet, they just totally avoided me. And as a result, I stopped thinking about Vietnam consciously anyway. And I stopped talking about it. I never told anybody I went to Vietnam. I didn't even tell people I was in the military. And it got to the point where I actually buried almost all the memories of Vietnam, buried so deep. If you had asked me at one point, was I in Vietnam, I would have had to stop and think about it. If you asked me if I was in the Army, I would have had to stop and think about it. The memories were that far below the surface. And that went on from 1969 to about 1985, and all during that time, again, one part of me thought I was okay, everything was back to normal, but it really wasn't, and as a result, I was bucking authority. I quit IBM. I went to work for a couple of other companies. I was jumping around. We moved to Florida. We spent 8 years in Florida. We moved back to Philadelphia. And then one day in 1985, Judy and I were laying in bed watching The Tonight Show or the news or something like that. And the phone rang, and I answered the phone. And when it rang, I just had a weird feeling that I can't quite describe, except I knew something was going to happen. And I said hello. The voice on the other end said, is this Howard Patrick? I said, yes. He says, are you the Howard Patrick that was in Vietnam in the Civil Affairs Unit, in the PSYOPs Unit, et cetera, et cetera? And I said, yes, to all those things. He said, Howard, this is Chad. And I said, yeah. He said, Howard, it's Chad Spar. And I said, well, I think you have me at a disadvantage. I don't know anybody by that name. And the entire there he is. And there's me to the right. The entire 5 months that I was in the Civil Affairs and PSYOPs unit, Chad and I worked very, very closely together. And we were as tight as two guys could be back then. And I remembered absolutely nothing about him. And I was so upset and so worked up. I spent weeks and then turned into months at every waking moment. And even moments when I should have been asleep, I was awake and thinking about why couldn't I remember Chad? And finally, one day, I was dreaming, and there he was right in front of me, and I remembered who he was, and that opened the door to over time to many of the other memories that I had buried that I really didn't want to remember. And it got to the point where I wasn't any good at work. I had a very good job when we were in Florida. I was with another computer company and opened a tech school for the company, and then moved back to Philadelphia to open a tech school for a company that I had worked for previously. And I had a great job. Lived in a nice house, 4-bedroom, split level, half-acre of ground, 2-car garage, a dog, 2.5 kids, as the saying goes, and I couldn't concentrate on work anymore. I couldn't really stay focused, and I wound up leaving that, left it all. And from that point, for the next almost 10 years, I just went from one job to another. One thing led to another thing and another issue, and I just couldn't keep working, couldn't focus, couldn't stay involved in anything, and to the point where I was physically in pain. You know, I had headaches, I had body aches. To the point where one day I decided worth living.
That puts a lot of strain on the family unit itself.
It certainly did. You know, Judy, I didn't know till later, but Judy was ready to, say goodbye and take the kids. We had a son shortly after I got home from Vietnam, so we had a son and a daughter. Judy was ready to bail out with both of them. But this one day I hadn't smoked in years, and went and bought a pack of cigarettes, went to the liquor store and bought a pint of whiskey, and took out the bottle of pills that I had taken from the house, and woke up 2 days later in the hospital after they pumped my stomach. My son had around that time, right after that time, he opened a coffee shop in downtown Philadelphia, and I wasn't able to work anywhere, so he talked me into working in the store with him, and I was getting a cup of coffee for a customer, and handed it to him, told him how much it cost. He reached in his pocket and took out a money clip, and it had a First Cab patch on it, or a little insignia. And I said, I was in the First Cab. And we got to talking, and over the next couple of weeks and months, we became kind of friendly. He would stop in often. And one day he pulled me aside and he said, Howard, I got to talk to you. And in fact, we went outside, and he said, you've got a problem. You've got PTSD. And I didn't even know what PTSD stood for. And anyway, to make a long story short, he got me into the vet center, one of the local vet centers, for counseling. and that's what really, really helped a lot. Um, although the counseling, the medication that the psychiatrist gave me didn't work at all. Every medicine he tried on me gave me more trouble than it cured. And the individual um, treatment or therapy that I received, it was okay, but it wasn't really doing anything for me. So I stopped for a while. And then my wife and my daughter, who was a nurse, talked me into going back. And I did. And I wound up in a group therapy session. And that's what really saved me, saved my life. Because for the first time, I was actually able to talk about Vietnam and talk about my experiences because I was with guys who had similar experiences and we could relate to one another. And that really, really made all the difference in the world for me, to the point where that's when I said, I should put some of this down in writing. I should write a book so my kids and my family and my wife and my sister and my grandkids would get a better understanding of me and what happened to me and how PTSD changed my life, how Vietnam changed my life. So I did put the story together, and as Bill led off that one slide. Uh, it really helped my family. It helped my wife, and it helped me. It was very therapeutic. It's what was the beginnings of what actually enabled me to get to the point where I could do what I'm doing right at this moment, talking about my past, talking about my experiences, and what you see now in front of you is so true. It's not that we refuse to let go of the past. The past won't let go of us. You can take the boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the boy. And it's the same thing with Vietnam. You
Well,
can
Howard,
take the soldier out of Vietnam, but you can't take Vietnam out of his head.
yeah, there's a saying, when were you in Vietnam last? And it was last night.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
it's the PTSD, depression, and so forth. You don't really realize what the problem is. Just learning that I had a problem, and that something could be done about it, and the group has been a lifesaver. It's amazing
It
just what and talking to other veterans and finding out that, oh, they got the same problem I got, and it's not, you're not crazy. And it's not a disorder. It's a syndrome, but it's not a disorder. There are changes from post traumatic stress disorder
uh,
to just post traumatic stress, but uh, uh, I imagine the therapy of
I,
writing a
I've
book.
done I, I've
Go ahead.
I've done a lot of research, Bill, on PTSD, and one thing I found out is um, repetitive traumatic situations, which we had almost every day in Vietnam. You go out on a mission, and it turns out to be very traumatic. And those repetitive issues, those repetitive situations of traumatic issues, is actually causes a chemical change in the brain. And as of now, there's no way to reverse that chemical change. You can be treated, you can get therapy, you can get medicine, and you can learn, as Bill did and as I did, how to better handle the PTSD, but you never ever get rid of it. You just learn to deal with it a little bit better than you had before. And learning that I had PTSD is what saved my marriage. When Judy realized that I wasn't just crazy, that there was something physically wrong with me, that was causing all these problems. It really brought us together like we never had been before.
Was she able to go to any of the
What's
vet
up on the
center?
screen now?
Howard, was she able to go to any of the vet center meetings for families or whatever?
she went to a couple of sessions at the Philadelphia VA hospital, and she also met with a couple of wives of fellow veterans that I became friendly with, and they were able to talk to each other, and that was very good for Judy, very therapeutic for Judy, because just like talking to the vets at the vet center for me was when I was able to relate, we were able to relate to each other. She also realized that it wasn't just her alone, that there were other people, that other wives going through the same kinds of things, and it was therapeutic for her also.
Tell us a little bit about the book itself now. We're getting kind of short, so I want to make sure we get information about the book and how veterans or veterans' families can get out there and get the book and so forth. So,
well, here's it's not coming up too well.
There you go. Thanks.
There we go. There's a picture of the book. Um, it it covers the period that I started off with, from when I graduated high school right up till today. And part of the reason for publishing the book, I self-published it, and part of a big reason for doing that was to give other veterans and their families more information about PTSD, and information that they could learn how they could best handle the situations, as Judy and I have. It's tough for the families, tougher for the families sometimes than it is for the veteran. So this was put together with that in mind, and my goal has been to put the book in as many hands of veterans and their families as possible. In fact, it's available on Amazon, and if you go to my website, which is howardpatrick.weebly.com, and Weebly is spelled Weebly. If you go to my website, there's a link there to buy the book, and it takes you to the Amazon site. And it's available in a printed version, and also in a Kindle download. And for the past 4 years, for 5 days leading up to Veterans Day, November the 11th, I've given away free Kindle downloads of the book for those 5 days during those 5 years. So far, I'm up to about 2,500 free Kindle downloads have been given away. And I've done that because, again, my intention is to put the book in the hands of as many people that can benefit from it as possible. If I can help even just one veteran and one family, help them deal with this devastating disease, or whatever you want to call it, then it's worth it to me. And what's up on the screen now is so true, but understand that a lot of people who are non-military, especially non-combat military, can never fully understand exactly what we've gone through. I've had people say to me, Howard, it's been 25 years, it's been 40 years, put it aside and forget about it. Well, we can't just do that. We have to live with it. And the ideal situation is find a way to live with it in a way that is an improvement over what it was.
Yeah. Howard, does someone sent you a message? I'm not reading the message.
Howard, Greg Nickel.
Greg Nickel is a fellow vet that was in my squad in Vietnam.
Yeah, he's saying great info. He will email you, and it's good to see your face, brother. Said we have both come a long way.
I'm glad to hear that. Greg and I are in contact off and on. Uh, and but by the way, speaking of in contact, after 40 years, I was in touch with one of the guys from Echo Recon, and he put us in touch with another one, and we wound up having in '08, in 2008, we had a reunion with six of us, and over the next few years, that went up to about a dozen at one time at the reunion. And unfortunately, we're getting older. We're not as healthy as we used to be. So we haven't had any reunions in the last couple of years. But I have to say one other thing. I mentioned the call I got in '85 from Chad Spar. And a couple of years ago, I was on Facebook and I got one of those instant messages. And a message said, "Howard, this is Chad." And Chad and I hooked up after all these years. And he's been very active in an organization called POVA, POVA, Psychological Operations Veterans Association. In fact, he was one of the founders of it and is for the second or third time the president of the association. And 2 years ago, no, I'm sorry, yeah, 3 years ago, they had a reunion, and I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and met with Chad for the first time in almost 50 years, and it was a wonderful thing, and we've been in touch on a regular basis ever since.
Howard, I want to speak to the audience. I highly recommend you. I wear my Vietnam veteran hat. It gives me an opportunity to meet a lot of Vietnam veterans and talk and so forth. But people always coming up and says, "Thank you for your service" and so forth, and welcome home. What I'd like for them to do instead of that is get a bunch of your books, read it for themselves, but have it on hand. And I've ordered some. Going to do the same thing. I've got a lot of Vietnam friends that I meet with in our group meetings, and I plan on giving them a copy of the book. But have the book available and spread it out. If you really appreciate the veteran service, get the book and show them how much you appreciate it by giving them the book. Even if you are a veteran out there, anytime anybody goes off the war, it changes them drastically. And this book could do a whole lot more good than you'd ever think about doing. Much better than walking up. And I do appreciate anybody that says, "Thank you for your service." But this would be a good way to show them how much you appreciate it, hand them a copy of the book and say, "This is something I read and I appreciate what you've done. And I want to give you this." And
that's a very nice thing you're saying there, Bill, and very much appreciated. And I would just like to say one other thing, and that is the book really, really helped my wife Judy to the point where she's so supportive and so wonderful. In fact, I was talking to one of the psychologists that was providing therapy for me one day, and telling him how much I appreciated all she's done. And I said, "She really deserves a medal." And he said, well, why don't you get her one? And I said, "Gee, that's a thought. That's an idea." And I racked my brain to figure out what kind of a medal would be appropriate. And realizing that over the years, she suffered tremendously as well. And in fact, she's got something called secondary PTSD, which spouses pick up from their husbands or even their wives, and can bring on the same kind of symptoms that those of us with full-fledged PTSD experience. So I felt that her being with me caused her to get wounded in action. So what did I do? I went out and I bought a Purple Heart, and I gave that to Judy in appreciation for all that she's done for me.
I'm glad you got that part in about how
And there it is.
important it is to remember the wives and the families involved also in the book that was able to help them and so forth, because it's like I said, it's not an individual problem, it's a family problem. And
it certainly is. It really and truly is. And I'm glad, Bill, that you gave me this time to talk about my experiences in my book. And again, if if anybody wants to contact me, they can.
They can contact you by Facebook.
They can contact me by Facebook, Howard Patrick. They can contact me by email. My email address is HB as in boy, Patrick 43 at gmail.com. HBPatrick43 at gmail.com. And again, my website is www.howardpatrick.weebly.com. There's a lot of pictures there as well that people might find interesting.
All right, we're gonna sign off, but hold on, and I want to come back and talk to you after the show. So
very good, Bill. Thanks again.
We hope you had got some good insight on post-traumatic stress and the person. No one returns from the war unchanged, as we talked about. As I mentioned, I have purchased several copies of the book, which I'm planning on giving out to Vietnam veterans and their families and so forth. Next Lessons of Vietnam show, live show that is, will be 26th of December, and we'll be discussing Vietnam and the nuclear option. Please don't forget you can watch this show or any of our past shows by using the on demand. You can go on an hour or so from now, you can go online on demand to Nissan Communications and watch this show again in case there's anything you missed. If you're local, on the 16th of December at the Raleigh State Capitol, the candlelight service there where the luminaries will be lit for the 38th from North Carolina still missing. And also on January 5th, the POW-MIA ceremony that has been going on for 32 plus years by North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated will be at 12 o'clock noon on the 5th of January. Going back to the candlelight service, that's at 6 o'clock. So be sure to, if you're local, come to one of those two events or both of them. From M9 and I, we wish you a very Merry Christmas and look forward to talking with you on the 26th. And thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you in the next show.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.